Welcome to the annual meeting of members, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is Chris Wood. Before I get started with the formal forced march or presentation, that is the state of TU, I just want to acknowledge a few people. First, the Wisconsin Council, which I learned last night is different from the Minnesota Council, has done just a great job at pulling this event together. Let's give a big round of applause for all those folks. Second, I know we have at least a few TU trustees and Coldwater Conservation Fund trustees that are here. If you all could stand up for just a moment. These folks donate their time and their talent and their treasure to TU. Thank you all so much. And then last, but most important in my world, actually you could argue that the board is more important in my world, but I have the pleasure of every day working with some of the hardest working finest people that you'll ever meet, and that is the staff of TU. So if all the staff in TU would stand up and be recognized. It's like high school. They're all in the back of the class. So I flew into Chicago a few days ago, and I had the pleasure of fishing one of the driftless area streams. Interestingly, when I go out with the Wisconsin volunteers, I find out that none of these streams actually have names, and there's some odd reason you have to wear a blindfold to get to the river. But when I flew into the Chicago airport, the woman behind the rental car counter, she saw that I had my TU colors on, and she said, "Trout Unlimited. What do you all do?" And I said, "Well, are you an angler?" And she said, "Yeah, I like to fish." And I said, "Well, simply stated, we make your fishing better." And she said, "Oh, okay." And when you think about it, the list of rivers that I'm going to go through here and streams that we work on around the country it's almost like a who's who of some of the finest trout and salmon streams in the country. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why they are so good. And it's because of the work that you all do in those places, on those rivers, every day, every week, every year. And we're going to talk about a lot of that today. But to simply say that TU makes fishing better, while technically accurate, only describes a small part of what it means to be a TU volunteer and a small part of the heart of an angler. It's just a piece of the shared passion that we all have for these wonderful streams and rivers that we all love so much and that give us such joy. And I was thinking about the work of TU and in the context that we conduct that work in when I was having a meeting just recently with someone in Washington. One of the parts of my job that I really enjoy is working with administration officials and members of Congress and their staff and agency heads to advocate for TU's highest conservation priorities. And in this case, as is often the case, I was talking about Bristol Bay. And in the middle of my spiel, and it is a spiel at this point, the person I was meeting with, who's a friend of mine, stopped me and she said, "Dude, how can we focus on Bristol Bay and conservation until we get the economy back on track?" And I thought about that for a minute, and I must admit it sort of knocked me off balance. And I gave some offhand answer probably, but it's almost as though we have taken conservation, the single most optimistic, affirmative, forward-looking idea that America ever gave the rest of the world, and we've made it secondary or subservient to broader, more important issues like the economy. And I think there's a consequence to that kind of thinking. And you see that consequence reflected in the news. I looked this morning just to see if the government was going to shut down or not. It still appears that we're headed that way. And so much of the national dialogue today, and this is not a political statement, this is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, so much of the national dialogue today is driven by fear. So right now, in this news cycle, it's fear of the government shutting down and what that might mean. But next week it could be fear of terrorism, or it could be fear of bad jobs numbers. It could be fear of a national disaster, fear of another international military engagement. It could be fear that we're raising a generation of children that, for the first time in the history of this country, stands a good chance of being less healthy and living less long lives, not living as long as the previous generation. Now, while this is maddening and it's exasperating and it's really frustrating, especially if you live in Washington, D.C., and you're exposed to this sort of 24/7, the one thing it is not new. This is not a new dynamic. Now, my favorite author is William Faulkner. And 50 years ago, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, at the time that Faulkner was writing, the prevailing fear that was gripping the country was what later became known as nuclear proliferation. But the then Soviet Union had discovered the atom bomb. We had the atom bomb. We had used it a couple times. And at that time, and some of you in this audience probably remember this, we literally had drills in grammar schools where kids would dive under their desks when the bell rang to prepare in the event of a nuclear attack. I distinctly remember it at my grammar school, St. Cashin's in New Jersey. I remember one day helping the janitor remove a bunch of these big tin, excuse me, I won't do that again, these big tin boxes full of crackers and big jugs of water. And I asked him, I said, Mike, what is all this for? And he said, well, St. Cashin's is a fallout shelter. And I said, well, what's a fallout shelter? And he said, well, in the event of a nuclear attack, people can come here and we'll have crackers and water for them. I must tell you, at that point in my sort of 10-year-old life, the thing I feared most were the nuns, and now I had something new to think about. But to go back to Faulkner, when Faulkner accepted the Nobel Prize, he did a great diagnosis of this problem that I just described in I think in terms of our contemporary discourse, and I'd like to read it to you. He said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal fear so long sustained that by now we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. He must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basest of all things is to be afraid, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but the old universal truths, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed. Love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice." Now, Faulkner was talking, obviously, about writers and writing. But those nouns perfectly describe what it means to be a TU volunteer, right? It is love that compels you all to work through programs such as Trout in the Classroom, the Stream Explorers program, our teen camps, the youth camps. How many people in this room have volunteered or participated in a youth camp? You don't do that out of some sense of obligation. You do it out of love because you believe in the imperative of passing on the joy that you have taken from the outdoors and from nature and passing that on to the next generation of kids who may not be exposed to it without your help. It is compassion and pride that drive the fact that every single TU chapter, and some do a lot more, dedicate on average 2,000 hours of community service to the places they live. And it is a tribute to the sacrifice of our veterans that we spend as much time as we do, and we'll talk about this a little more later, helping them to tie flies or teaching them to fly fish or otherwise helping them to access the healing power of water, which all of us know in a very deep and intrinsic way. So I want you, as I go through the state of TU and reflect on some of the accomplishments of the past year, I want you to keep those nouns, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. I want you to keep those in mind. And I'm going to come back to Faulkner at the end. But just think about that as we go through the presentation. Now this next slide I know is very familiar to you. This has been sort of the frame that we've talked about much of our project work over the past few years. And I will tell you that this is a very partial and incomplete map. What we have focused on this year are basically the significant accomplishments of the year, the actual accomplishments. And all of you who are engaged in chapter project work know that many of these projects aren't one-offs. You know, they take multiple years to get done. This is probably a quarter, maybe a fifth of the rivers and streams that TU is working around the country. And when I say TU, I mean the national staff of TU, although all of our work is done in concert with the grassroots. If I were to put up on here, and I'd like to do this sometime, all the work of the chapters and councils in addition to the work of the national organization, your national organization, I would have to talk longer than Senator Cruz to be able to get through the state of TU. The scope of work that we are engaged in around the country is absolutely phenomenal. And how is that made possible? Because of you. So give yourself a round of applause. You set a record this year for the total number of volunteer hours. Look at that trend line. That's extraordinary. I mean, the amount of work that you all do on an annual basis is simply phenomenal, and it makes what we do possible. There's another reason for that map I showed you earlier, and it's these guys. We're now at 198 staff inside of TU. I begged Hillary just to let us hire 2 more, so I could say there were 200 today. But probably by the end of next week there may be. We had a retreat this year for the first time in 6 years in West Virginia, and this is about 160-ish of the now 198 staff that work for you in this organization. Another reflection of the growth can be seen here. I will tell you that I struggle to, what is the, I know what quadrupled means. Is it quintupled? We have quintupled our growth. We've grown 5 times in the span of 11 years. I don't know another company that's had that growth trend. And keep in mind that this has occurred during one of the worst economic cycles in the country's history, at least in our recent memory. So, you know, what is behind this explosive growth and this extraordinary work that we're able to accomplish? And I'll tell you what it is. We have a secret weapon.
And on the 8th day, God looked down on his planned paradise and said, I need a caretaker. So God made a fisherman. God said, I need somebody willing to get up before dawn, knock the ice off her boots, spend her only day off thrashing about in a 30-mile-an-hour headwind, come home cold and soaking, take her boots off, and tell her husband she had the time of her life, and mean it. So God made a fisherman. God said, I need somebody with arms strong enough to battle the catch of a lifetime, to fight it as if life and limb were dependent on it, and then be humble enough to concede, give thanks, and wish it well on its upstream journey. I need somebody tough and stubborn, someone who will brave sun and wind and snow, someone willing to move heaven and earth to make the world as it was meant to be, tending, laboring, sweating. Someone with a backbone strong enough to look a mining company that wants to build a huge open-pit mine in the headwaters of the world's most prolific salmon fishery in Alaska and say, no, this will not do, not on my watch. So God made a fisherman. God said, I need somebody who can tie a surgeon's knot, throw a mend in a line, give the historical flow data for that day, differentiate between Terra Narcissus californicus and Calinuria californica, recite their common names in order of hatch, open a beer with his teeth, and then look to his comrades with praise for the day, all the while holding the boat in perfect position, and do it with a smile. So God made a fisherman. God said, I need somebody crazy enough to tie a weighted leech to the end of a child's line, then duck for cover as it comes whizzing past his earlobe, all for the joy that comes with that first fish. Somebody who would teach that child, who would patch a scraped knee, wipe a tear, and reply, you're doing great. And when that fisherman finished off a week of hard work, put himself aside and drove 40 minutes to a church basement where he'll teach wounded vets how to tie flies after planting willows on an old trout stream, all to find a way to protect and restore that place he loves so much for his kids. Well, then God said, now I'm on to something. So God made a TU member.
Could you not listen to Walt Gasson's voice all day long? Compliments to Shauna Sherrard and Josh Duplashane and Chris Hunt, who helped to pull this together, and so much of the rest of this presentation. But and apologies to Paul Harvey. I think those of you who saw the Super Bowl probably saw that we completely ripped that off from And God Made a Farmer. But so be it. All of you are familiar by now with the first order of business of any effective conservation strategy has to be to protect the best habitats, to protect the most important habitats. We're lucky enough to have the administrator of EPA here today. She's not here now, but she'll be here later on today. She's going to talk with us all, and she's going to want to talk about climate change adaptation. It just so happens that our model of protecting, reconnecting, and restoring river systems is, in fact, a climate change adaptation model. I expect I would be fairly stunned if someone in the audience didn't ask her a question about the topic that I'm about to speak on. If that's not the case, I will seed the audience with someone who will ask her a question or two on that. But Bristol Bay is our top conservation priority. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we're all pretty familiar with the issue, except to say this. There are 7 rivers that drain into Bristol Bay. There are 2 of them, the Kvichak and the Nushagak, that are particularly noteworthy. The Kvichak, every year, supplies half of the world's wild sockeye salmon. One river, half of the world's wild sockeye salmon. That's crazy. The second river, the Nushagak, every year is among the top 2 to 3 Chinook producers in the world. And I didn't mention that on the Kvichak, you stand a decent chance of catching a 30-inch rainbow. It is not a steelhead, it is actually a rainbow. It is precisely in the headwaters of those 2 rivers that a mining company has proposed building what would likely be North America's largest open-pit gold, copper, and molybdenum mine. That mine, it would require them to hold the toxic tailings back from this massive mineralized area. The Bristol Bay region is the size of Ohio, with 5,000 people living in it. And the mineral deposit is massive, but it's spread over a large landscape. There's a reason they call it the Pebble deposit, because the actual mineralization is vast, but you're not digging big ore bodies out. So they have to process tons of material. And the toxic waste from that processing would be stored behind a 700-foot earthen dam that would be 4 miles in length. This is in a highly seismically active area. The power plant that they'd have to build, see, I'm doing what I said I wasn't going to do. I'm going to stop myself after this. The power plant that they'd have to build to support that mine would be larger than the power plant that now supports the city of Anchorage. It's just a really bad idea. So I'm happy to tell you that 2 weeks ago, the principal financial supporter for developing this mine, Anglo American, a massive multinational mining company, decided to pull out of the project. They not only pulled out of the project, they paid Northern Dynasty, the ones who discovered the claim, $300 million to get out of it. And you know why they pulled out? They pulled out because they said they think it's too risky. It's too risky a venture. So, it's not the death knell for the mine by any means, but we are that much closer to stopping this mine in this place and making sure that no large-scale industrial mining ever takes place there. And that's why it's important that the administrator of EPA is here, because she needs to hear from us on this topic. And I assure you she'll hear from me, but I encourage you to make your voice known as well. Another recent success just a few weeks ago was in Utah. Utah has now been in the midst for a while of a collaborative planning effort to try to protect the most important lands from a fish and wildlife perspective in perpetuity, but also to allow for energy development and other forms of development to occur. This is being led by Congressman Rob Bishop. Rob Bishop is not what I would call a flaming liberal, but he's in good faith leading this effort to try to resolve some of these long-standing conflicts in Utah. While that was going on, the State Land Commission in Utah, which has a statutory responsibility for raising revenues for schools, decided to allow for an oil and gas lease in the Book Cliffs. This is a hugely important area. It's probably one of the finest places to hunt in the state, and it's got some remarkable wild fisheries there. TU immediately responded. We organized a whole coalition of sportsman voices to make their ire known. Congressman Bishop publicly opposed the development, and then the Republican governor of the state publicly opposed the development. And because of that pressure, I'm happy to tell you that SITLA, the State Land Commission that offered the area for leasing, decided to take the portion that was most controversial and put it in a 3-year timeout to allow the legislative process to play out. So the Book Cliffs are no longer threatened at the moment by oil and gas development. Well, we all know that it's not enough to simply draw lines on a map and call an area protected because of the floods and the fires and the drought that are going to increase as these climatological changes persist. So it's vital that we reconnect these protected areas to downstream areas so we can have fish swim through connected systems.
Tell Denver Water to keep Colorado's namesake river healthy. Go to defendthecolorado.org and help protect the lifeblood of our state.
Okay, now everyone get situated. We're going to get one shot.
It's the collective efforts of us as individuals coming up here. We can make a difference. I think anybody who uses the resources in this state, whether you're a hunter or fisherman, you should be giving something back to the resource.
We're in the very headwaters of the Columbia River, and the Columbia River steelhead and salmon are in tough shape. Idaho Water Project will take segments of streams, Canyon Creek being one of them, Little Springs Creek in the upper Lemhi, and we'll identify projects where we think we can help bring some fish back.
Well, we're trying to make a real good effort to recover salmon and steelhead. They need help.
We couldn't do it without getting 40 or 50 of these people here willing to work hard for a couple of days.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Good.
A lot of great work has happened, all because of Trout Unlimited volunteers.
So it's a great example of the way we engage in reconnect projects, right? Sometimes it's just we need physical labor. We need people out there to help replumb some of these systems, whether it's moving culverts or creating better in-stream habitat. But we also need people who can engage, in this case, in a comedic way, but in the very complicated policy fights. And I want to just talk about that for a minute. So the Upper Colorado is such an important river system from a wild native fish perspective. Right now, 60% of all of the water from the Upper Colorado is diverted over to the Front Range for municipal uses. The proposals that have been out there for 10 years or more have been to take an additional 20%. And so that would effectively kill that system, to take an additional 20% so people in Boulder can have bluegrass lawns. And actually, I shouldn't say that. Those are legitimate municipal needs. But taking 80% of the Upper Colorado would be devastating. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, we were in a complete litigation posture against this proposal by it's the Northern Colorado Conservancy District. We were against this proposal that they had, Northern Colorado Water Users District, I'm sorry, to divert additional flows from the Upper Colorado. If you had asked me then, I would have told you we were going to litigate that. Ultimately, that would be litigated and we would win or lose in court. And instead, what happened over time is that our staff in Colorado sat down and began talking with the water district to find out what Northern actually needed. And at the end of the day, they reached an agreement where we're going to create a bypass around a reservoir that was previously a thermal barrier for fish to get through. They're going to create a 4 or 5 mile bypass around the channel, and then they're going to provide I think they're flushing flows, they're called, to make sure that we have flows in the winter months when the fish need them most. And they're going to create a $4 million mitigation fund. So after we've created the bypass around the reservoir, we'll be able to do in-stream work to extend the connectivity of the Upper Colorado system. We have moved from a position of hell no over our dead body on this project to one of strong support for the project, because we figured out a way to do it in a way that meets the needs of the water users, but also will not simply make things okay for fish, it's going to actually improve the fishery. And the other reason that that's significant is that there's a proposal now, which that video actually talks about, to do a similar project on the Fraser River, a significant tributary to the Upper Colorado. And the model that we've created with Northern should be applied to the Fraser, and we think we can do that with Denver water. So, precedent-setting work in Colorado. Talking about precedent-setting work, last year I stood up here and I told you how several weeks prior I had been with then Secretary Salazar in Maine, and we were taking down the Great Works Dam. I always get the Great Works Dam and the VZ Dam confused, so I'm hoping I'm not mixing these up. But this year, we took the VZ Dam down. So we've now removed 2 significant barriers in the Penobscot system for anadromous fish. And what's left for us to do is to create a bypass around the 3rd dam. And when we have finished doing that, this will be the largest scale restoration project ever done in this country. Now, we've had other significant lifts that this organization has been involved with, including on the Elwha, the removal of the Elwha. The difference between this and the Elwha was that TU's advocacy and the advocacy of the Washington Council was absolutely vital to getting that done. But then the big boys stepped in. The federal government stepped in, the state stepped in, and they provided the base funding to get the work done. On the Penobscot project, we not only struck the agreement, but then we had to go out and raise the money, and half of the money had to come from private sources, and we did that. We actually operated these dams for several years and raised $3.5 million that we contributed to the restoration effort. So significant things happening in the Penobscot, and I'll tell you, this is not going to simply benefit Atlantic salmon, but it will. It's also going to benefit a host of other sea-run species, anadromous fish, such as stripers and alewives and shad and herring. But it, without question, represents our last best chance to recover Atlantic salmon in this country. The lifeblood of TU has always been habitat restoration. This is what all of our chapters basically pioneered, and let's learn a little bit more about that.
My name is Dustin Wisterman. I'm the Potomac Headwaters Project Coordinator for Trout Unlimited. Brook trout is a keystone species for the Keystone Initiative. This guy represents good, cold, clean water. Approximately 11-inch brook trout. This is not the norm. So it puts a huge smile on my face. This just shows that this water is good and cold and clean and remains that way throughout the year. In order for these fish to survive throughout the warmer summer months, it's imperative that the cold water is here and it has to be clean gravel for spawning the fall. So we need to protect these very sensitive areas that surround these streams.
The stream program is important in restoring the habitat of brook trout to keep them here and to keep them healthy. I want to make sure it's done the right way and for all the generations that are coming along behind us.
It's important to restore areas like Jackknife.
I think the goal with Jackknife Creek is to try to heal that system.
It's not just the area that we're working in that's going to be affected by this. It's all the way downstream.
Without the South Fork of the Snake, southeast Idaho would just be another dot on the map. There he is. Got him.
This has always been a great place for me to come and recreate and to kind of repair my soul. I certainly believe that all of this work that we're doing on these tributaries does restore hope. It gives promise to what we can do to bring things back.
Giving hope and promise to bring things back. There's no better example of that than our work on Kettle Creek. Last year, for the first time in my knowledge, we recovered native brook trout to areas that we had done acid mine remediation. This year we continued that work and we did 7 to 10 more miles of acid mine remediation on these streams. And importantly, the work that we began 15 years ago on Kettle Creek, is now being used by the state of Pennsylvania and applied to the 4,000 AMD damaged streams around that state. Another really cool aspect of the work up here that TU's been involved in is over 2,000 children in that area were educated about acid mine drainage and what can be done about it. And those kids are going to be the advocates that help to recover a lot of these other streams after we're gone. We continue our work with the Wyoming Council and the Montana Council and the science team and the remarkable efforts of one volunteer, Dave Sweat, to help suppress lake trout in the Yellowstone National Park and Yellowstone Lake in particular. In the span of the time I left college, we have seen a decline in Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the lake of over 90%. And it's because of the invasion of these lake trout that were introduced in the 80s. We, meaning the Park Service and TU and our other partners, removed over 400,000 lake trout through commercial netting techniques this year. And for the first time in 15 years, we've actually seen an increase in spawning habitat for Yellowstone cutthroat, or spawning reds for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and they're actually catching fewer lakers in the nets now, and they're catching more Yellowstone cutthroat trouts. So this is a place where we are actually going to beat back an invasive species and recover a native fishery. We're never going to suppress them, we're never going to eradicate them, but we can suppress them to such a level that we can bring back the native fish. So protect, reconnect, restore, that's the biological imperative of the organization. The social imperative is how do we make sure that this stuff can endure over time? And let's listen a little bit about that. The mission of Trout Unlimited as an organization is to protect and conserve trout and salmon and the river systems, the watersheds that they live in. We realized that if we were serious about TU's mission and our objective of recovering wild and native fish so that our children could fish for them in their home waters within a generation, we had to start thinking about that next generation.
Studies show that our young people today are spending dramatically more time sitting indoors, attached to their video games and computer screens, and less time having fun, being active outdoors.
We decided to create a distinct and discrete youth education program at the national level, and that's the program that we call today Headwaters.
Headwaters is TU's program to get more youth interested in Trout Unlimited, and it goes from elementary all the way through college.
Obviously we try and improve the fly fishing, but we also really focus on conservation and we try and make sure that our waterways will be preserved for the next generation.
If young people don't have the opportunities to have fun outdoors, they won't feel a connection or have an umbilical cord to Mother Nature, so they'll be less likely to fight to protect her when they grow up.
How are we going to get them involved and keep them involved so that by the time they get into their mid to late 20s, they understand that TU is a place that's very vibrant, where they can go and get involved in conservation, where they can go fishing with other people, they can follow their passion with a sport, but they can also become a really good steward of the environment.
So we've just had Franklin Tate and his staff, and that was Ido Kiernan, who's the chair of our Headwaters board, a former trustee of the organization, have just done remarkable work at building this program. We now have the ability to intersect with kids from early grammar school all the way through college. And then once we get them in college, the doorway into TU is wide open. And our chapters are working very closely with those college chapters that you heard referenced above, the Five Rivers program. I think this is going to be a major emphasis and a major growth area for us in the future. As I mentioned earlier, you all have had a great year. You logged in 675,000 hours of volunteer hours. We brought in over 2,500 new members this year. You generated from the chapter and council level, over $10 million in new revenue. If you monetize those volunteer hours, it means that it's a $25 million contribution to TU. So we're not actually a $40 million a year conservation organization. We're a $65 million a year organization. Women in TU continues to be a priority for us. I wrote a column about this in the magazine not long ago. Mary Weiss of the NLC has been doing a great job helping to lead this effort for us. We had a 25% increase in the number of women members last year. Now, I will tell you that part of that was because we gave the memberships away, and they need to renew. But the sad news is that it still only represents about 8,000. So we need to do a better job of being an open organization, a more inclusive organization, not just for women, but for people of color as well. If we continue to look the way that we do now, in 50 years, we will not be here any longer. The demographics are working against us. So the volunteer operations staff, along with Mary and other staff at TU, have created a whole toolbox that's available for chapters that they can access to look at tips and tricks and tools for ways, new and better, improved ways to engage more women, more minorities into the organization. I wanted to go back to that quote by William Faulkner because I think his diagnosis of the problem, while apt, is not as important as what he said the fix for the problem was. So recall that he was talking about love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Faulkner finished his quote by saying, "Until he relearns these things, the writer will write as though he stood among and watched the end of man. I refuse to accept this. The writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man, it can be one of the props, the pillars, to help him endure and prevail." So, dude, how do we focus on Bristol Bay and conservation until we get the economy back on track is precisely the wrong question. By focusing on conservation, yes, by making fishing better, we are making the world a better place. We are helping to sustain the lands and waters that in turn sustain us. By protecting headwater streams, we are reducing downstream water filtration costs for local communities. By reconnecting rivers to floodplains, we are minimizing damaging floods, such as the horrific flooding that occurred in the Front Range. And by engaging in watershed scale restoration, we're creating hundreds, probably thousands, from this organization alone, thousands of family wage, high-paying jobs. Every time we partner with a mining company, with an oil and gas company, if they're willing to work with us, with an irrigator, we are building community in an otherwise fractured world. And yes, we are in fact serving, to use Faulkner's words, as one of the props and the pillars that will help this country to sustain itself and endure. That's what you do every day through your support at TU. And for that, you have my thanks, and that of the staff and the board, our appreciation. Thank you.